this is kind of a departure for me, but about 10 or 11 years ago, I started getting interested along with my wife with the history of Madison, and we joined the Historical Society, and hence my interest in it. And the more I delved into it, the more interesting I found it. So it's a pleasure to give this presentation tonight. I've invited my better half, my wife Susan, who I'll show you right here. There she is, to join me for two good reasons. One, she is a tech whiz, which I am not. But secondly, she had served 4 terms as president of the Madison Historical Society. So I've asked her, I'll give the major address tonight, and then I've asked her to join me in the question and answer period, because she's very knowledgeable on the history of Madison. The presentation is accompanied by a slideshow, PowerPoint slideshow. It'll run maybe 45 minutes to a max of around 50 minutes, and then we'll open it up for question and answers. So I think we'll go ahead and get started, and let's go ahead and share the screen. We'll get going. Slideshow. Yeah. You're probably on the second slide. Click on the right, hit previous. Yeah, click on it and go to the previous, to the right, and hit the previous, right there. Yeah. Okay, here we go. The history of Madison is really a story of place, events, and people. Speaking of people, this is the lady on a bicycle. We have no idea who she is, but we're very fond of this picture. And around the end of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, bicycles were very popular in Madison. And there was, in fact, a bicycle club, which quite regularly cycled their way to Morristown and back as a ritual activity. So I thought it'd be nice to use the lady on a bicycle as the lead slide. Certainly, Madison's proximity to the burgeoning metropolises of New York City and Newark was critical in the history. The forces also of the American Revolution, the Civil War, the great European migrations, the Industrial Revolution, World War I and II, the Cold War, as well as the dawning of the digital age, all had their influence. Finally, and most importantly, it is the story of people, common people, farmers, blacksmiths, small shop owners, ministers, policemen, firemen, artisans, gardeners, horse breeders, housewives, teachers, and cooks, all who carved out a life for themselves in the community. And there were some uncommon people as well, people of great wealth who over the years helped finance much of the infrastructure of the borough. People of great national and international accomplishment, builders, publishers, government leaders, medical practitioners, and researchers, artists, and leaders in the performing arts. Now, there's no way in a brief time that one can relay, I think, the full richness and depth of Madison history, but perhaps I can at least, to some degree, highlight key events and people that have played a significant role in the borough's past. I would like to divide the history into 3 eras, each with its own characteristics, contributing to Madison's development. The first I call the Bottle Hill era, from 1710 to 1834. The second is the era of explosive growth, 1834 to 1889. And finally, what I call the maturation or maturing era, 1889 to the present, a really long period of time. We begin with the Bottle Hill era from 1710 to 1834. And this first period takes us from the pre-Revolutionary War years through the American Revolution and early years of the 19th century. It is a period in which Madison grows from little more than a few scattered farms into a good-sized village. As some of you may already know, Madison did not start out with the name Madison. It had several names, the most well-known being Bottle Hill. The initial settlement of the area occurred in and around 1710 by people from Elizabethtown, which eventually became Elizabeth, as well as Newark and Long Island. The majority of settlers purchased their land from what was known as the West Jersey proprietors. These were holders of large grants from the British Crown. Other settlers bought land from the Lenape Indians. John Budd bought 15,000 acres in the Chatham area, and his land included a piece that was shaped like a bottle and had two hills, which he called Bottle Lot. Some say that this was the origin of the name Bottle Hill. Later, writers claim the source of the name came from the sign on a public house in the shape of a bottle. Morris County, created in 1739, was divided into 3 townships. The portion of the village north of Kings Road was put under the governance of Hanover Township, and the portion to the south under the governance of Morris Township. And during these early years, the general area was known as South Hanover. 2 names that are steeped in Madison history are Miller and Burnett. About a quarter mile after you turn right off of Park Avenue onto Ridgedale Avenue, you will run into the Luke Miller House on the right-hand side. It is thought that the house was built in 1730 by Andrew Miller, Luke's father, and originally called Miller Station. The land was bought from David Burnett. A forge was built on the property and served the community for many years, including during the American Revolution. Here we see the Miller House today. I should mention that a number of years ago, the Historical Society sponsored an archaeological dig on the property, attempting to uncover the original location and dimensions of the forge. And you can see the tarps on the lawn there where the dig was, looking for the forge remnants. The small building constructed near the actual forge has been undergoing a restoration, and when completed will serve as a mini museum with, among other things, artifacts from the forge and tools of the time. Around 1745, a Daniel Sayre built a house that also stands on Ridgedale Avenue, about a block down the street after you turn onto Ridgedale off of Park. It is during this time, roughly 1745 to 1776, that the community begins to take shape. In 1747, the Presbyterian Meeting House was built above Kings Road at the site of the present cemetery on Main Street known as Hillside Cemetery. In 1776, around the outset of the American Revolution, there are perhaps 20 families in residence, maybe 100 to 150 people. A little cluster of homes along Ridgedale Avenue and Kings Road was known as Bottle Hill. One thing to note here is that during these really early years of the borough, Kings Road was the main thoroughfare. Today it stops as it runs into Main Street. But in the 18th century, long before the railroad, it continued on and ran into what is now Park Avenue. And one of its main cross-street intersections was with Ridgedale Avenue. During the Revolutionary War in 1777, after victories at Trenton and Princeton, the Continental Army established an encampment in Bottle Hill in the area called the Ymca and Spring Valley, that was at the western edge of what we now call Giralda Farms. This was part of a large movement and quartering of forces. Washington put his officers and some 8,000 men in houses and barns throughout Hanover, Whippany, Chatham, and Bottle Hill, what is now Madison. But over the years, a question arose as to whether the Bottle Hill encampment ever took place. and if it did, its precise location. Doubt centered on the dearth of both written and physical evidence, despite a detailed account of the encampment by one Silas Brookfield, who lived nearby at the time. Doubt about the encampment was pretty much brought to a rest when a Boy Scout from Chatham, Brian Stipe, working with his father Bill just a few years ago, uncovered a trove of relics from the encampment on the southwest corner of Giralda Farm property, not far from St. Hubert's Animal Welfare Center. The Stiples explored a part of the old Dodge Estate property, now the industrial park, known as Giralda Farms, in an area that now is part of Chatham Township, not far from St. Hubert's, near the corner of Treadwell and Woodland, and across from the Boisabon Estate. The Stiles uncovered all sorts of items, including buttons, a shoe buckle, melted lead used to make ammunition. In all, over 50 items were found. Several noted military officers graced Bottle Hill with their presence during the American Revolution. We know that General Mad Anthony Wayne stayed with the Sayres in the Sayre House. Wayne got his nickname for his fiery personality and fearlessness in battle. Here we see him in the upper left-hand corner being carried by his men after being wounded. Finally, it is thought that General Washington himself was a frequent guest at the Luke Miller home, and his horses and those of his officers were tended to at the Miller farm. Not long after the Revolutionary War, Bottle Hill began to expand its limited lines of communication with other communities with the establishment of its first regularly scheduled stagecoach stop between Morristown and the community of Paulus Hook, now known as Jersey City. The image on the screen is that of a typical stagecoach of the time, this particular one operating in and around Trenton. It was in 1804 that the Morris Turnpike opened a 34-foot wide road that ran through Bottle Hill from Elizabeth to Morristown with a toll gate at Rosedale Avenue, the present location of the Wells Fargo Bank. Here we see the toll building, which eventually became a private home and was later torn down for commercial reasons. Of course, this turnpike is the present Route 124, or Main Street, as it runs through Chatham and Madison. As some of you may already know, a parallel road known as Shunpike evolved and got its name from the obvious, to avoid the toll pike, hence shunning the pike, or Shunpike. In 1809, the Madison Academy was built on the corner of Park Avenue and Ridgedale by a stock company organized by a number of leading citizens. It was an elaborate and costly building for those times, and children of the community were educated there for 72 years. The land had been donated for the purpose of a school by, again, James Burnett. The school was later moved to Green Avenue. We now come to an event which, while not critical in the development of Madison, nevertheless is an essential part of its history. In 1819, Stephen D. Hunting of the Morris County Militia purchased the original site of the Bottle Hill Tavern, located on the corner of Main Street and Waverly Place, where the Chase Bank now stands. Through the years, it was also known as the Waverly House, the Madison House, Bottle Hill Tavern, and the Widow Brown. In 1922, the Madison Historical Society was founded by a group of citizens committed to saving the Bottle Hill Tavern. The First National Bank purchased the site in 1922 for a new building and intended to tear it down, the old tavern. A group of spirited and committed citizens led a successful fundraising effort to pay the cost of moving the tavern to a location further down Main Street. And you can see this is we don't have any clear photographs of this, but this is the one that appeared in the newspaper at the time. And it was moved to the present location of the Bank of America on Main Street. On New Year's Day, 1988, the Bottle Hill Inn closed its doors for the last time. In its final incarnation, it was known as the Widow Brown's Inn, a popular restaurant here in town, and you see it in the upper left-hand slide. The building stood vacant until 1991 when it was raised, and the Bank of America building was built to resemble the old original building, and that obviously is on the lower right-hand corner. Returning to our chronology, in July of 1825, the Marquis de Lafayette returned to the United States and was warmly welcomed in Bottle Hill. Lafayette, you remember, had fought alongside Washington during the Revolution, including the horrible winter at Valley Forge. Now, we don't think of Madison as being a big industrial town. It would be silly to contend that it was certainly a major hub of manufacturing. Yet in the early 1830s, Caleb Burroughs, Burroughs being another famous name in Madison history, established a cabinet making and undertaking business at a site on Main Street where Burroughs, Core, and Dangler now operate. The major blacksmith facility in Bottle Hill was owned and operated by Charles C. Force, F-O-R-C-E, and served the community for decades. It eventually became the Madison Ironworks on College Road that we now know as Park Avenue. One of the largest enterprises during this period was Henry Keith's Bonnet and Umbrella Factory, located on the corner of Prospect Street and Kings Road. It employed approximately 100 women and several men. Unfortunately, we do not have a picture of it. By 1839, the borough had a pretty thriving economy. In addition to the Burroughs and Keep enterprises, it had a distillery, 4 coopers, 2 shoe manufacturers, 2 wagon manufacturers, 2 painters, 2 tailors, 1 organ manufacturer, 1 additional furniture manufacturer besides Burroughs, a tailor, a baker, 4 dry goods and a grocery store, 2 doctors, and 12 master builders. In 1832, William Gibbons, a millionaire from Georgia, bought land west of Bottle Hill and built a mansion on the property between 1833 and 1836. They called the estate the Forest. The mansion is now the administration building for Drew University, which now sits on what was once the Gibbons property. Several years before establishing the Forest in Madison, Thomas Gibbons, William's father, was party to one of the most famous and important US Supreme Court cases in American history. The 1824 Gibbons versus Ogden was a landmark decision in which the Supreme Court of the United States held that the power to regulate interstate commerce was granted to Congress by the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. The case had to do with the navigation rights in state waters, New York having granted exclusive rights to Robert Fulton and Robert Livingston for steam-powered vessels. Thomas Gibbons operated a steamship line in New Jersey waters and into New York City. The plaintiff, Aaron Ogden, was granted a special exclusive license for New York waters by Fulton and Livingston, and wanted Gibbons shut down. Gibbons pushed the argument that when it involved interstate commerce, in this case, New Jersey to New York, the federal government in the form of Congress has the right to regulate. Gibbons won the case, with his primary attorney being none other than Daniel Webster. The second era in Madison's history is a relatively short 55-year period, but it is a period that saw what can only be described as enormous growth in transportation, business, and religion that really transformed Madison from a rather sleepy little community to an incredibly vibrant and economically powerful community. By the end of this period, the population of the town reaches 3,754, more than double what it was 20 years earlier. And it is the beginning of the era, 1834, that at the instigation of public-spirited and temperance-minded citizens, the community changed its name from Bottle Hill to Madison after President James Madison. Despite the name change, however, you have to remember that Bottle Hill, or now Madison, is still not incorporated as an independent entity. Over the years, it has been linked with a number of surrounding communities. As of this year, 1834, it remained a section of Chatham Township. It will be another 55 years before Madison is entirely independent. Now, it was no accident that I chose a railroad engine to represent this second historical period. As we mentioned earlier, the first great transportation event for Madison was the establishment of the Morris Turnpike in 1804. The second occurred in 1837, 33 years later, when the Morrison Essex Railroad came to Madison from Newark. At first, two horses pulled a small car over the single track line that crawled over the summit of Short Hills. Shortly after completion of the rail line, a tiny steam locomotive provided the power for one passenger car and one freight car twice a day. This particular image on the screen is of Madison in 1838, about the time the first railroad went through the borough. At this time, it might be appropriate to once again break out of our chronology a bit and comment on the development of the railroad, perhaps the single most important event in the evolution of Madison as an affluent, vibrant community. In addition to the commuter service, the establishment of a dependable railroad service from Madison to New York in 1865 was critical for the commercial development of the community. In particular, the rose industry in Madison flourished because of the railroad and probably would not have existed if it had not been for the train. And more on the rose industry later. Further, when the railroad came, Madison also became a popular vacation place for city dwellers who wanted a healthful stay in the country, clean air, pure water, and beautiful views. Before too long, wealthy city dwellers were building large estates throughout the area, something we will talk about in a few minutes. In turn, the estates became a source of employment for people from a variety of ethnic backgrounds, Scotch, Irish, Black, and Italian. The engine in this slide is the Essex, built for the Morris and Essex Railroad in 1838 by Seth Boyden of Newark, a very famous nationally known engine builder. With the addition of the cab for the engineer and fireman and a cowcatcher on the front, we can see the Essex in a somewhat more familiar image of a standard steam locomotive. This is, by the way, the earliest known photograph of the Essex that ran from Jersey City through Madison. The first major railroad station in Madison was located at ground level at the corner of Waverly and Kings Road. Later, in the early 1900s, prominent members of the Madison community were involved in the funding of the raising of the railroad tracks and the building of the Madison Railroad Station. And in this regard, another important name in the history of Madison is James. Ellenstein Stebbins James, the widow of Daniel Willis James, urged the railroad management to build a station that would reflect the elegant status of the area's fashionable millionaires. James made his money from several sources, but chief among them was the mining of copper and the production of copper wire. It was Mrs. James who financed much of the expense of road grading necessitated by the track elevation. And we'll have more to say about the Jameses in a few minutes. The station itself was originally designed by the railroad's in-house architect, William H. Botsford, who unfortunately found himself a doomed ticket holder on the maiden voyage of the Titanic. Another architect, F.J. Nyes, took over the project, and the final design is in the collegiate Gothic style and completed in 1916. Now let us return to the 19th century and our second era that you remember ran from 1834 to 1889. It is during this period that the community saw an explosion in both the founding and expansion of Madison's religious community. In 1825, the first parish building to be used as a Catholic church and rectory was built on Ridgedale Avenue. The parish had been started in the late 1700s by French refugees who came to America after the French Revolution. In 1839, St. Vincent Martyr Catholic Church was officially dedicated. The original building at 69 Ridgedale Avenue is now a family residence built on the original church's foundation, and that is on the lower right-hand side of the slide here. The current church The current church was built on Green Village Road in 1906. In 1843, the Madison United Methodist Church was officially organized, although Methodism had been practiced in the town since 1803. As we covered earlier, in 1749, the Presbyterian Session House was built overlooking the hillside cemetery. In 1825, a new church was built on Main Street that later became and remains the Masonic Lodge. You should be able to recognize that building there. The Presbyterian Church then moved to Webb Chapel in 1887 in the upper right-hand side of the slide. And here we see the full complex today in the other image with a new sanctuary that was dedicated in 1954. In 1854, the first Episcopal services were held in a private home, and a year later, the cornerstone of Grace Episcopal Church was laid, and the building was consecrated in 1857. The First Baptist Church was founded in 1895 and was housed at the Oddfellows Hall on Central Avenue. In 1902, the construction was completed for its current location on Cook Avenue. And in 1853, the first building for a Black church, the Union Church, was erected in the present Fairwood section of Madison. In 1864, it was moved to a new site on Kings Road at the corner of Kings Road and Cross Street. In the 1870s, the organization came under the supervision of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And in 1885, the present Bethel AME Church was constructed on the corner of Central Avenue and Chapel Street. In this regard, it is important to note that African Americans had been living in Bottle Hill since the early 1800s. Many had been indentured servants or slaves, and after the Civil War, most worked in various capacities on the estates of the wealthy residents. At roughly the same time as Madison witnessed this surge in religious institution, another development took place that in many respects put Madison on the map, at least along the eastern seaboard, and that was the beginning of the rose growing industry. In 1856, the first greenhouse began operating when Alfred M. Treadwell built several greenhouses on his estate. And for over a century, Madison was known as the Rose City and still is. In 1896, 45 growers in Madison placed 80 to 100 boxes of roses on a 7 a.m. train to New York City each and every day. The growers had 505,740 square feet of greenhouse glass. One of the largest of the growers was Thomas J. Slaughter, a New York merchant. In 1886, Slaughter alone marketed roughly 40,000 roses per month, and 1 month exceeded 50,000. In 1927, one of the largest growers, Charles Toddy, processed more than 200,000 orders for his roses that were shipped all over the country and abroad, primarily to Europe. By 1930, Toddy was producing 500,000 roses annually. The industry reached its height in the 1950s with firms like Rose Farms Corp. And Watchung Rose Corporation. Watchung Rose alone had 100,000 plants producing 3 million roses yearly, with over 8,000 roses harvested each day. The growing of roses for the New York market was once a vital industry here, but the premium on land for housing, the cost of heating greenhouses, and the competition from Florida caused a decline in the industry. The last commercial greenhouse in Madison was raised in 1885 to make way for a residential development. We are now approaching the Civil War years, 1861 to 1865. The Madison and Chatham areas had their share of abolitionist sentiment. Local residents participated in what became known as the Underground Railroad, aiding escaped slaves from the South by providing safe houses in the northern states and in Canada. The Boisebon House on Treadwell Avenue was a stop on the railroad, as was Sayre House that we noted earlier. Generally sympathetic to the Northern cause, a fair number of Madisonians served in the Union Army. But it is also true that a fair number also avoided service through the practice of hiring substitutes. Perhaps the most famous Madisonian to serve was Isaac Gordon. Gordon had been born a slave and became a hero of the Civil War as he guided Union forces through Virginia. He also warned the Union Army at Washington, D.C. of an impending attack by Jubal Early's Confederate forces. In part because of Gordon's advance warning, the Northern Army was prepared and able to reinforce its position and ward off the Confederates. After the war, Gordon came to Madison with his friend, Union General E.E. Potter, and lived in the borough for many years, well-liked and respected. We have no image of Isaac Gordon, but his gravestone can be seen at the Hillside Cemetery. In 1862, James Augustus Webb and his wife, Margaretta, came to Madison and together became great benefactors to the borough, Webb making his fortune in the production of industrial alcohol. Augustus almost immediately helped to organize the YMCA and later funded the building for the facility on Main Street that now serves as an office building on the left there. As noted earlier, he and his wife, Margaretta, built the Gothic Webb Memorial Chapel on Green Avenue in remembrance of their son who died in 1887. And they also provided the land and donated a new clubhouse for the Madison Golf Club. In 1865, the Clexson family from Germany set up a winery on Fairview Avenue in the rear of a large home. The Clexson Winery initially produced sacramental wine, but in the 20th century expanded into many varieties, including champagne. The house still stands today as a private residence. In 1867, Drew University was founded as a Drew Theological Seminary by the Methodist Episcopal Church with the help of robber baron Daniel Drew, who donated part of the former William Gibbons estate to the church after buying the property from William Hayward Gibbons. Drew was deeply involved in the steamship and railroad business. The Gibbons mansion was renamed Meade Hall after Drew's wife, Roxana Meade. Daniel Drew also endowed the institution with $250,000, a lot of money in its day. In 1928, the College of Liberal Arts was added to Drew with some 1,500 graduates today. In 1955, a graduate program was added with degrees now offered in education, fine arts, poetry, arts and letters, medical humanities, history, culture, finance, and data analytics. Just about the time Drew was founded as a theological school in 1867, Madison gains a new resident of some note. William Osborne Stoddard served as President Abraham Lincoln's third secretary on his personal staff. Later in life, after his years serving the president in the White House, Stoddard became a resident of Madison, continuing his writing, focusing on his experience serving Lincoln and extending the family tree to include some of the most well-known names in Madison's history, including Britton, Webb, and Holden. Stoddard's years at the White House were obviously fascinating given the time. One of his proudest accomplishments was his first writer of the Emancipation Proclamation from Lincoln's original draft in 1862. He had a particularly good relationship with Mrs. Lincoln, specifically assigned to her to assist in handling her correspondence. He became somewhat of a buffer between Mrs. Lincoln and the other two secretaries, John G. Nicolay and John Hay, with whom the First Lady had a very strained relationship. Upon leaving the White House, Stoddard was appointed U.S. Attorney in Arkansas, and after serving there, Stoddard moved to Madison with his wife, Susan, and established residence on Central Avenue, devoting a great deal of time, and yet another book, Abraham Lincoln, The True Story of a Great Life. Stoddard ceased writing about 1909 and passed away in Madison in 1925. It was also in this period that a paper known as the Madison Eye-Opener began, publishing monthly for 3 issues. Later, the name was changed to the Madison Journal, and in 1882, it became known as the Madison Weekly Eagle. Today, it is known simply as the Eagle or the Madison Eagle. After a disastrous fire in the heart of town in 1877, a volunteer fire department for Madison was founded in 1881. William J. Britton, another great name in Madison history, donated a lot at the corner of Elmer Street and Central Avenue, where a truck house was built in 1882. The fire department bought one fire wagon with equipment that included buckets, since the town had no water mains. When there was a fire, the firemen had to use borrowed hoses. The firemen drew no wages, but had to pay dues of $3 a year and were fined each time they missed an alarm. In 1883, Madison got telephone service. A small switchboard was located in the Harmon drugstore on Waverly Place. The monthly charge was $4.16 for telephone communications with Morristown and $5 for New York and Newark. And this brings us to the third area of Madison's history, running from 1889 to the present and spanning the Industrial Revolution, World War I, Prohibition, World War II, as well as the Cold War and its aftermath. It is a long period with many new buildings, institutions, and people joining the community, far more than I can give justice to, since I will be selective. We are now in 1889, and finally, the Borough of Madison is incorporated with a James P. Albright as the first mayor. He is the second from the left in the second row. The population desired independence from Chatham Township so they could have a municipal water supply and an electric utility. The water plant was built in 1891 on Station Road, and within 5 years, the water and light utilities were self-supporting. With the borough government in place and the volunteer fire department, the last major piece of governance, the Madison Police Department, was established in 1890. While some wealthy patrons to Madison had already contributed to the growth of the borough, it is around this time that the great millionaires really began to make their presence known. Remember that Madison was at the eastern edge of what was known as Millionaires Row, that stretched from Madison to Morristown and all over the surrounding area. Names like Ballantyne, Freelinghouse, and Mellon, Colgate, Scribner were among the well-known. One of the first millionaire patrons to Madison were Daniel Willis James and his wife Elizabeth, who we have mentioned earlier in connection with the railroad and the railroad station. In 1892, they constructed an Elizabethan mansion known as Onunda that sat on what is now Giralda Farms. We're going to see this building again in a few minutes. James' first gift to the people of Madison was James Park, dedicated on July 4th, 1898. You can see in the upper left-hand corner the construction going on, and then what it looks like today, a beautiful spring day. Next was a free public library given to Madison in 1899. The style of the building is Richardson Romanesque Gothic, and some of you may recognize it as now housing the Museum of Early Trades and Craft, listed on state and national registers of historic sites. The third gift, built roughly the same time as the library, was the James Building, located on the corner of Green Village Road and Main Street. James built the building to financially support the public library across the street. In 1900, the estate of Hamilton McKay Twombly and Florence Vanderbilt Twombly was opened. On that occasion, ice cream and cake were served to the entire population of Madison. The main house, which was named Florham, is a replica of Henry VIII's Hampton Court in England. The main part of the estate is now a campus of Fairleigh Dickinson University, and Madison High School occupies a small part of the original estate. Here we see Florence Vanderbilt Twombly. The Twombly family gave 42 acres for the high school on Ridgedale Avenue. Now, one topic we have not yet talked about much is diversity in the borough. We did mention earlier that Black citizens had been living and working in the community for some time, but it is in the latter half of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th that Madison receives two additional waves of people contributing enormously to the diversity of the town, both arriving during the Great European Migration. The smaller of the two groups were the Irish, who actually began arriving in mid-century, many passing through Castle Garden in New York City. By the late 1800s, names like Corbett, O'Brien, McCarthy, and O'Donnell make their presence known. They become immediately engaged in the rose-going industry and the building trades. Indeed, most impressive was John V. Corbett, who was the builder of St. Vincent's Church, Central Avenue School, the James Library, and the first YMCA. The second group of immigrants, largely passing through Ellis Island, was of course the Italians, and names like Mayone, Esposito, and Olaco became part of Madison's rich history. Like the Irish, they gravitated to the rose industry and found employment in construction, particularly on the railroad. Many had come from agricultural regions of Italy and became landscapers on some of the great estates, and some became small business owners, such as barbers and shoemakers. Speaking of diversity, I have spoken a bit about the Jameses, the Twombleys, and other noted millionaires of the Gilded Age. Well, Madison had another millionaire, perhaps a little different, and I would like to introduce him to you. His name was Naylor Harrison. Little known to many Madison residents, gypsies are an integral part of the history of Madison. For years prior to and after the turn of the century, gypsies made the borough the site of an annual camp. The trek to Madison came in the form of a train of colorful wagons. Their leader was Gypsy King Naylor Harrison, who reigned over the gypsies of the entire eastern part of the United States. Harrison always denied being a king of anything, but if one explores any of the number of histories and websites devoted to the American gypsies, there is little doubt about Naylor Harrison's strong ties to the gypsy community. Harrison and his wife traveled extensively throughout the United States, but summered at his modest house on Greenwood Avenue near the intersection with Ridgedale Avenue in Florham Park. Harrison's wealth was largely based on his horse trading business and real estate. Indeed, he was considered one of the shrewdest horse traders in the entire country. He regularly furnished horses for, among others, the Twombly family. Together, the Harrisons had 9 sons and 5 daughters, all married except 2 sons, and all with large families. 4 of the sons attended Princeton University. Gypsy King Naylor Harrison died on July 3rd, 1928, and is buried in Hillside Cemetery. 1917 brings the United States into World War I. Within 5 weeks of Wilson's declaration of war, Madison women, led by Margaret Guggenheim Powell, are granted a charter to establish a chapter of the American National Red Cross. Volunteers regularly meet at the Madison Academy to gather and send supplies to soldiers from Madison engaged in the war. While a significant number of men served in the front, it was a woman, Amabel Scharf Roberts, in the center of this slide, who garnered the most attention. This citizen of Madison was the first American Army nurse to give her life in the war while serving in France, and like Naylor Harrison, is also buried in Hillside Cemetery. In the decade following the war, community service became a huge thing in Madison. One thing we already talked about was the formation of the Madison Historical Society, founded in the effort to save the Bottle Hill Tavern. Another was a bequest in the 1920 will of Mrs. Mary Brown Cash of what was known as Settlement House, where the Thursday Morning Club found a new home, the club having been originally founded in 1896. The club, as well as the building now known as Community House, are still an integral part of Madison life. For well over a century, the Thursday Morning Club was put together a long array of volunteer achievements. Well, Prohibition was very strongly supported in Madison. The temperance movement, supported by the Drew Methodist Seminary, that was before I got there, urged people to abstain from the demon rum. So strong was the movement here in Madison, the town went dry 6 months before national prohibition began. The Depression, of course, hit much of the nation very hard, but Madison generally suffered a little less, at least at first. Of course, it did not hurt that a major construction project was underway at the time, the Hartley Dodge Memorial Building, dedicated in 1935. Speaking of the Dodge Memorial, it is time to introduce perhaps the most well-known of Madison's millionaire benefactors, Mrs. Geraldine Rockefeller Dodge, the daughter of William Rockefeller. Indeed, one can assert that she is the most famous citizen in the history of Madison. In bringing her up, it would not be fair, however, to ignore her husband, because the two made for quite a pair. Marcellus Hartley Dodge, or Marcy as he was known to family and friends, married Ethel Geraldine Rockefeller in 1907, making them the wealthiest couple in the United States. Geraldine was the niece of Standard Oil founder John D. Rockefeller. Marcy Dodge was the son of Norman Dodge, linked to the Phelps Dodge fortune, and was also heir to the Hartley fortune. It was Marcy's great-grandfather, Marcellus, who founded Schuyler, Hartley, and Graham Military and Sporting Goods Company and Union Metallic Cartridge Company that eventually became Remington Arms. For a brief period, the couple lived together at Hartley Farms, that is actually in Harding Township. Geraldine did not share her husband's strong attachment to the Hartley House Farm, and eventually established her own residence at Giralda in Madison, commonly referred to as the Dodge Mansion. Generally, when Geraldine was in town, they both resided at Giralda. When she was absent, Marcy headed back to the house in Harding. If the Giralda Mansion looks familiar, it should. It is the same mansion occupied at one time by the James, the estate then known as Anunda. They were, to say the least, a dynamic couple. Geraldine, of course, started the Morris Essex Dog Show in 1927. The show took place on the grounds of the Dodge estate in Harding, attracting as many as 50,000 spectators, and in its time became the largest single-day event in the world. Consistent with her love of dogs, Geraldine founded St. Hubert's Giralda Animal Shelter in 1939, and it was endowed in her will to continue to operate to this very day. Marcy Dodge was a committed environmentalist and locally led the fight to save the Great Swamp from becoming a regional airport. But it was the building of the Hartley Dodge Memorial Building that houses the borough government that is most famous. The building was a gift from Geraldine Dodge to the borough in memory of her son, Marcellus Hartley Dodge Jr., who at 22 years of age tragically died in an automobile accident while on vacation in France in August of 1930. The memorial was built between 1932 and 1935, with a final cost topping out at $800,000, roughly $10 million in today's money. The materials used in the building were world-class. Granite blocks were shipped from Lowell, Massachusetts. The council chamber floor was laid with black Belgian marble and white stone from Colorado. On the second floor are doors made of solid mahogany imported from Honduras. Inside, Mrs. Dodge adorned the halls and rooms with valuable works of art, including portraits of George and Martha Washington by American painter Rembrandt Peale, a marble relief sculpture of Washington by John Adams Jackson, an oil painting of John Quincy Adams by George Peter Alexander Healy, and a full-standing portrait of Abraham Lincoln by William Carl Frederick Travers. And finally, there was a marble bust of Napoleon by Rodin that not too long ago was sold to the Rodin exhibit at the Philadelphia Art Museum. As we moved out of the Depression, we moved right into World War II, and young men and women served in droves, and Madison was no exception. In reference to Madison's service during the war, it is relevant to point out that despite their integration into the local economy, there had always been a strained relationship between the Italian residents of the borough and the wider community. But the enormous contributions and sacrifice of the town's Italian citizens toward the war effort helped to achieve greater acceptance. As of early 1943, over 200 Italian Americans from the town were serving in the military. On the home front, the town was doing its part. The Madison Ironworks held major contracts for material parts, specifically mufflers used in submarines and landing craft. The works received 3 of the coveted Excellence Awards from the Navy and 2 personal visits from the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt. Well, by the 1950s, Madison is part of the post-World War II economic boom, rapidly becoming an affluent suburb. In 1950, the population is up to 10,417, and 10 years later, in 1960, it rises to a little over 15,000. New neighborhoods are cropping up, such as the large home developments of Crossgates and Dellwood, the Harwood development on Woodland, and the Spring Garden region of split-level homes in the 1960s. In 1958, Fairleigh Dickinson University established a 3rd campus on the former Twombly estate in Madison and Florham Park. And Madison High School moved into its new building on Ridgedale Avenue. For years, the present junior school had served the high school. You get that? Okay. In 1963, the YMCA merged with the Chatham YMCA and moved to its new building on Keep Street. In 1968, the Madison Public Library moved to its new location on Keep Street. In 1976, another huge event. In December, Prudential Insurance Company Realty, that is the Pick Realty, purchased Giralda Farms. The mayor, the planning board, and Pick Realty hammered out an agreement for a corporate campus. There would be 5 office buildings occupying about 15% of the estate. The rest would remain as private parkland, and most parking would have to be underground. The new corporate residents have continued the tradition established by past owners of the property in providing support for borough organizations and opening the grounds for community activities. Pick Realty installed a macadam bicycle trail around 3 sides of the perimeter, and joggers, strollers, and dog walkers put the trail to good use year-round. In the summer of 1984, and every succeeding summer, the Morris Area Arts Council sponsors a Pops concert by the New Jersey Symphony on the grounds. In 1984, 4 sites of low and moderate income housing were dedicated at Station Road, Community Place, Belmont Avenue, and Park Avenue at Elm. And finally, on this issue of expansion, we all know that land in Madison is limited. Nevertheless, the borough continues to grow. 2 of the more recent major projects are the expansion of the Y and the opening of Rose Hall apartment and condo complex. Now, I have not spent much time, actually almost none, on the politics of Madison. Historically, governance of the town has been overwhelmingly Republican, white, and male, certainly until recently. But the period 1970 to 1984 witnessed a startling opening up of the borough's government. Now, giving credit where credit is due, this slide on the left-hand side is a page from Frank Esposito's superb history of Madison, the Madison Historic Heritage Trail. In the upper left is Glenn Head, a Republican and the first 4-term mayor of Madison. But as good a mayor as he might have been, he is not why I have this slide on the screen. In 1972, Constance Stober became the first woman ever to serve on the council and the first Democrat in 20 years. In 1973, Ralph Mayone became the first male Democratic councilman in 30 years. In 1976, Frances Mantone became the first Republican woman ever on the council. And in 1980, William Primus became the first Black councilman ever in Madison. And in 1980, Elizabeth Baumgardner, a Democrat, became the first woman mayor in the history of the borough. It was in 1988 the ground was broken for the Route 24 extension west from Short Hills to Route 2 I-287 in Hanover Township. This relieved an enormously difficult traffic situation on Main Street. Until Route 24 was finished, for hours a day, the main thoroughfare through Madison and Chatham was a virtual parking lot. In 2007, Madison received the largest open space grant ever awarded by the Morris County Open Space Trust Fund. It provided $6 million to aid Madison in the $13 million purchase of the 53-acre property for the Madison Recreation Center. The property adjacent to Madison High School was part of the former Exxon campus, which was originally part, as we noted before, the Twombly property. The land was annexed to Madison, and the borough authorized the construction of multiple recreation fields on the property. Now, as we draw this history to a close, it is important to note that we mentioned a number of individual family names critical to the borough of history. Names like Miller, Burnett, Sayre, Britton, James, Webb, Gibbons, Burroughs, Force, and Keep, just to name some of them. But it is also important to recognize that there have been a number of noted people who were either born and raised here or who lived here during some of their most productive years. These are Madisonians of great national and international accomplishment and worthy of mention. Louis Sayre of the noted Sayre family was considered the father of orthopedic surgery in the United States. George Yeaman. George Yeaman was a Unionist member of the US Senate from Kentucky who defied his party and voted for the 13th Amendment ending slavery. He was one of 3 deciding votes. Later, he moved to Madison and was instrumental in founding the Madison Golf Club. William A. Sterrett, who was known worldwide as the king of skyscrapers and was responsible for building the Empire State Building. He also served a term on the Borough Council. John H. McGraw, founder of McGraw-Hill Publishing and creator of Business Week magazine. Vincent Jimmy Sedano, rose grower who patented the famous Spellbound and Little Princess roses. Lieutenant Samuel L. Corson, Madison's only Medal of Honor recipient for his courage in the Korean War. Rebecca Lassiter, ordained in 1956 as the first local elder in Madison's AME Church, a music teacher for over 60 years in the borough, named New Jersey's Mother of the Year in 1960, and in 1973 was presented the Distinguished Service Citation from the United Nations. Don Newcomb, renowned pitcher with the Brooklyn Dodgers and the first recipient of the Cy Young Award as the best pitcher in Major League Baseball. Professor Robert Chapman on Drew's faculty was the author of the American Dictionary of Slang and the chief editor of Roget's Thesaurus. Hildegard Peplow, known in global medical circles as the nurse of the century, who made the most significant changes in nursing since Florence Nightingale. Dr. George Kelsey, Drew theologian and mentor of Dr. Martin Luther King. Robert Adams, renowned photographer and author of the book American West. And Janine Garofalo, award-winning comedian and movie actress. Well, this concludes our journey through Madison's long history. How intriguing it is to think back to those early settlers in Bottle Hill prior to and during the Revolutionary War period and wonder how they would react to current day Madison should they be afforded the opportunity to return. My guess is they would be amazed by the town's diversity, its economic vibrancy, and its cultural richness. Thank you very much for your attention. And we'd like to turn this over now to a Q&A period. Tell you what, my email address for all of you is dsimon, S-I-M-O-N, @drew.edu. And if you have any questions, additional questions over and above the ones tonight, feel free to do that. And Lydia Swanson, if you can send me your email address when you get a chance, then I'll see what I can do about the slideshow.
We've got some thank yous.
Also, feel free to put your questions in the chat box if that works better for you.
Yeah, that's what we're looking at right now.
Michael.
You're welcome.
I know, Irene. Prior to the arrival of the first Europeans, who were original and first residents of Madison? That's the Indians?
Yeah, well, the Lenape Indians were in the region. And then the first people that migrated out from New York City and Long Island, the Newark area and so forth. Well, there were a fair number of British who came over. After all, it was a British colony. They were the first ones. There was probably a smattering of other Europeans at the same time, but of course it wasn't until later that the great European migrations took place with the Irish and the Italians and so forth. But I'm pretty sure that the first had English roots. The first non-Native Americans. Yeah. What else do we have?
I don't see any.
Are there any other questions?
Well, I said, if you think of any, don't be afraid to email, and Susan and I will try to answer them for you.
Do you have a book at the library? We are in the process of writing or updating the book.
Are you talking about the history book, the Madison history book?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
And the history book is out of print, actually. And so we are updating it, and we hope that maybe the end of next year, we'll have a new book so that it'll be the old book with additions.
And changes and edits. My email address is dsimon, DSIMON, at drew.edu. Okay.
And there are copies of the Heritage Trail at the library as well.
At the library,
yes,
yeah.
You can also join in and borrow. Wait a minute. My message here. D. Simon.
Yeah.
I gotta get it.
I know you don't like this keyboard any more than I do.
No.
DREW. .edu. Yep.
All right. Well, if there's no other questions, I just want to say thank you to Dr. Simon for providing us with this great lecture tonight. And thanks to the Friends of the Madison Public Library who make them possible. And if there's nothing else, we'll say good night.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. Good night.
Yeah.
Thank you.